So the last question I want to deal with today is whether redistribution increases wages. And I thought a good picture here to start with is from the introduction of our textbook. If you remember in the introduction, it also appears later in the book, Murphy looks at an occupational choice problem, occupation A, occupation B. A person has some skills at either of those occupations, HA and HB, and he's looking out there and saying, well, what is occupation A paying per unit human capital, and therefore in total? And how much is it paying in occupation B? And, well, if we draw the relative wage line, anybody with their human capital over in the A range is going to pick A because they're going to earn more as an A worker than a B worker. And anyone in the B range would do the opposite. Now in the book we call it, and in the video lectures, we call it occupation A is plumber and occupation B is carpenter. But again, we can relabel the variables and call the occupations market work and non-market activity. And be the same sort of questions. Who's going to pick non-market work versus market work? And that's going to, or non-market activity in general, and that's going to depend on their human capital in these different sectors, if you will. And that we talked about earlier, understanding the benefit system. Well, that's a kind of human capital in the non-market. Of course, there's human capital related to work, being good at your job, etc. And as Murphy points out in that introductory chapter, if there's something in the market or through policy that changes the relative wages of the two sectors, you're moving that ray and you're taking some people in whatever direction you're going, you're taking some people who were near the ray and throwing them into the other occupation. And that would, of course, still hold when we label the occupation as market versus non-market. Now, what human capitals are they going to have? Here's a opportunity set. You can see there's some downward sloping parts and upward sloping parts. In the upward sloping parts, there's opportunities. When you gain skill at one of the occupations, you also gain skill at the other. And we allow for that possibility. I think the interesting cases tend to be those where there's a trade-off. If I pursue more skill in one of these occupations, I'm going to end up getting less skill in the other occupations. And in this model, you're going to want to choose at one of the blue dots. And the reason you want to do that is because you're anticipating you're going to be choosing just to do one of the occupations or just the other and not both. And that's the, I've kind of zoomed out here to show now both the ray and the range of opportunities shown just the trade-off segment of that. So what can happen if we encourage people, we rotate this ray clockwise, and we encourage some people near the margin to leave market work and go to non-market work, that's going to affect their human capital. They're not going to be aiming for this blue dot anymore, they're going to be aiming for that blue dot. They're going to have less human capital for work, more human capital for not work. And that can affect their wages, depending on what you mean by wages. If you're thinking about wage as a quantity times a price, a quantity of human capital times a price of that human capital, then that would affect wages. So we might expect, and there's a famous paper, for example, by Sargent and Lundquist called the European Unemployment Dilemma, where they talk about, we had this period of unemployment in Europe, it was referring to the 70s and 80s, and the people who were out of work, they lost their skills. And then even when maybe jobs appeared for them, they weren't so rewarded to go back to work because they weren't so good at those jobs anymore. And this is another margin, in other words, I forgot where our list, if we're at 7 or 8 margins, but this is another margin where people respond to subsidies for not working. They change the amount or composition of their human capital. So you remember this from problem set, I think it was problem set 1? Deaton and Case talking about male high school diploma males in the United States over the last couple decades, and they see that their employment is falling and their wages are falling, and they say, oh, that must be because there's a shift in the demand for their labor. We're going to come in the problem set, you work with the problem, an issue with that. Now we've seen another issue, that the wage itself is a price times a quantity. So maybe their wages are falling because their employment is falling. Their human capital is changing. So it could be a shift in supply that causes the wages to fall. Whether the shift in supply is from benefits or some other factor, if people are on the supply side oriented toward not working, don't expect them to have human capital that raises their pay when working. Doesn't make sense for them to do that. And we're going to look more, we have this kind of simple 2-occupation model today. On Monday, we'll do more of a prototypical model where there's a greater range of human capital choice than just 2, but get similar kind of results. And I believe you did this part on problem set 1. I don't know if you did this exact picture, but we showed even if you ignore the issue that wages are kind of include a quantity element to them, just treat wages at pure price, if you have supply and demand both shifting, it could be that the main reason the quantity changes is supply, while the main reason that the wage changes is demand. So that brings us back to kind of the question that we posed. Does redistribution, what was the question? Does redistribution increase wages? Well, it might reduce human capital. And if by wages you mean a quantity of human capital times a reward per unit human capital, could well decrease wages.